The glass door of the executive office slammed shut behind Daniel Brooks. The second Victoria Hale grabbed his hand and pulled him against her chest. "Say nothing," she whispered, her voice shaking for the first time he'd ever heard. Then the door opened again, and her father walked in. "Dad," she said, steady now, "meet my boyfriend." Daniel's heart stopped. 6 hours earlier, he'd been drafting a resignation letter. Now he was standing in a stranger's lie, about to walk into a family war worth billions. Stick around till the end. You won't believe how far this story goes. And hey, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far this story travels. If you're new here, hit subscribe because this one's going to keep you up past midnight. The alarm on Daniel Brooks's phone went off at 5:12 in the morning. 4 minutes before it was supposed to, because the screen was cracked and the touch sensor had a mind of its own these days. He didn't bother fixing it. There wasn't money for a new phone, not this month, not with the electric bill sitting unpaid on the kitchen counter, and Lily's school needing $60 for a field trip permission slip he'd already signed, but hadn't figured out how to pay for. He lay there for a moment in the dark, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of his one-bedroom apartment in Queens, the one shaped vaguely like the state of Florida. And he did what he did every morning before his feet touched the floor. He counted. $2,140 in checking. Rent was due in 6 days at $1,800. That left $340 for groceries, for the electric bill, for gas, for whatever came up, and something always came up. Last week, it had been $110 to fix the loose brake pad on his 11-year-old Honda, because he wasn't about to drive his daughter around in a car that couldn't stop properly. The week before that, it was a permission slip and new sneakers because Lily's toes had started poking through the canvas. Daniel Brooks was 38 years old. He had a degree in finance from a state school. Nobody bragged about 12 years of experience reading spreadsheets and building risk models for other people's fortunes. And exactly one thing in the world that mattered to him: his 8-year-old daughter asleep in the next room, one arm flung over her stuffed rabbit, completely unaware that her father hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night in 3 years. His wife, her mother, had died when Lily was 5. An aneurysm, sudden, no warning, gone in the space of an afternoon. One day, she was making pancakes and laughing at something on the radio, and by dinner, Daniel was standing in a hospital hallway, being told there was nothing anyone could have done. He didn't talk about it much. Not because he'd made peace with it, but because grief for him wasn't something you processed. It was something you carried quietly in the space between your ribs, and you learned how to keep breathing around it. He got up. He made coffee in the same chipped mug he'd used for 6 years, the one with a fading picture of the Statue of Liberty that Lily had picked out at a gift shop in Battery Park, back before things had gotten hard. He packed her lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, the last of the pretzels, and he woke her gently, the way he always did, humming the tune to some song she liked so she wouldn't startle. "Is it a school day?" Lily mumbled, her hair a wild nest against the pillow. "It's a school day bug." "Can I wear the dress with the stars?" "You can wear whatever you want as long as it's warm enough." She smiled at that, small and sleepy, and Daniel felt the familiar ache in his chest that came every morning. Love so large it almost hurt, tangled up with a fear so constant, he'd stopped noticing it as fear anymore. It just felt like being alive. He dropped her at his neighbor Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, who watched her for 20 minutes before the bus came in exchange for Daniel fixing her ancient laptop once a month. And then he took the 7 train into Manhattan, standing the whole way, because sitting felt like a luxury he hadn't earned yet. And he walked the last 4 blocks to the gleaming, merciless tower that housed Hale Global Capital. Hale Global occupied floors 40 through 60 of one of the tallest buildings on Park Avenue, a monument of black glass and cold light that seemed on cloudy days to disappear into the sky entirely. Daniel had worked there for 4 years, ever since he'd been laid off from a smaller firm during a round of restructuring that had somehow spared every executive and eliminated every analyst under 40. Hale Global had hired him as a risk analyst in the fixed income division, a job that paid enough to survive in New York if you were careful, disciplined, and willing to skip things like vacations, new clothes, and dentist appointments that weren't emergencies. The firm was run, or more accurately ruled, by Victoria Hale, Victoria was 34 years old and had inherited operational control of Hale Global 3 years earlier after her mother's death and her father's quiet retreat from day-to-day leadership into an advisory role that mostly consisted of golf and grumbling. She had taken a firm that was solid but sleepy and turned it into one of the most aggressive, most profitable capital management operations on the East Coast. She had also in the process earned a nickname that followed her through every hallway, every elevator ride, every hushed conversation in the break room, the Ice Queen. Daniel had seen her exactly 4 times in 4 years. Once at an all-staff meeting where she'd stood at a podium and delivered a 15-minute address on quarterly performance, without once smiling, without once using the word we, always, I expect, I require, I will not tolerate. Once in an elevator where she'd stood in perfect silence, staring at the floor numbers, while everyone else in the car seemed to hold their breath. Once at a distance, walking through the trading floor flanked by 2 lawyers, her heels striking the marble like gunshots. And once 6 months ago when he'd been called into a compliance review of a report he'd filed, and she had sat at the head of the table for exactly 4 minutes, asked one question: "Is this number accurate?" and left without waiting for an answer beyond his single word yes. That was Victoria Hale to Daniel Brooks. A rumor. A weather system. Something you tried to stay out of the path of. So when his direct supervisor, a nervous, sweating man named Gary Pruitt, who ran the risk division and lived in perpetual fear of being noticed by upper management, appeared at Daniel's cubicle at 9:47 that morning, with a face the color of old paper, Daniel assumed exactly one thing. "Brooks," Gary said, "you need to go up to 60. Now." "What's on 60? "Her office." Daniel felt his stomach drop through the floor. "Whose office? Whose do you think Brooks hers? Ms. Hale wants to see you, personally, right now." Around him, the bullpen had gone quiet, in that particular way offices go quiet when something bad is happening to someone else, and everyone is simultaneously relieved it isn't them, and terrified it might be them next. A woman 2 desks over Priya gave him a look of genuine sympathy, the kind reserved for funerals. "Did I do something wrong?" Daniel asked, and he heard his own voice crack slightly on the word wrong. "I don't know," Gary said, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Nobody tells me anything. She just called down and said to send you up. Alone. Not me. You." Daniel's mind raced through everything he might have done. The quarterly risk report he'd filed 2 weeks ago, had there been an error? The compliance flag on the Merrick account he'd raised last month had that ruffled feathers somewhere above his pay grade. He thought of Lily. He thought of rent due in 6 days. He thought of the $1,800 and the $340 and the electric bill sitting unpaid on his kitchen counter, and he thought with a kind of cold sinking certainty that he was about to be fired. He straightened his tie. The only good tie he owned, navy blue. A gift from his wife, the Christmas before she died, and he took the elevator up to the 60th floor, with his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The executive floor was a different world. The carpet was thicker. The air smelled like money, some combination of leather orchids and the particular hush of a place where nobody ever had to raise their voice to be obeyed. A receptionist with perfect posture and a headset glanced up at him. "Mr. Brooks." "Yes." "She's expecting you. Go right in." Daniel walked toward the frosted glass double doors at the end of the hall, and for one absurd moment, he thought about turning around and running, just walking out of the building, going home, holding his daughter, and figuring out unemployment benefits later. Instead, he pushed the door open. Victoria Hale's office was enormous floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, looking out over the spine of Manhattan, the Hudson glittering somewhere in the distance under the July sun. She was standing at the window, with her back to him, when he entered, a phone pressed to her ear, and she didn't turn around immediately. "No," she was saying, her voice flat and precise, the voice of someone accustomed to never repeating herself. "I said no, Preston. I don't care what Dad told you. The board doesn't move on this without my signature, and my signature isn't coming. We'll discuss it at the house this weekend." A pause. "Yes, I'll be there." "With..." She hesitated just slightly, just enough that Daniel noticed it. "I'll be there. Goodbye." She hung up and turned around. Daniel had seen photographs of Victoria Hale in the company newsletter, in press coverage, in the framed portrait in the lobby. None of them had prepared him for the reality of being in a room with her. She was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than his monthly rent. Dark hair pulled back so severely, it seemed to sharpen her whole face into something carved rather than born. But it was her eyes that struck him pale gray, exhausted, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and fixed on him now with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under glass. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "sit down." He sat. The chair was too soft, too expensive, the kind of chair designed to make you feel small in the presence of the person behind the desk. "Ms. Hale, if this is about the Merrick account report, I can explain the discrepancy in the—" "This isn't about the Merrick account." She sat down across from him, folding her hands on the desk, and studied him for a long moment in silence. Daniel forced himself not to fidget. "Do you know why I called you up here, Mr. Brooks?" "No, ma'am. I assumed I was being let go." Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, but close to one gone before it fully formed. "You're not being let go. Your work is competent. Your risk models on the Halloway restructuring were frankly the only useful thing that came out of that entire division last quarter." Daniel exhaled, some of the tension in his shoulders unclenching. "Thank you. I didn't call you here to compliment your spreadsheets." She stood again, walked to the window, looked out at the city as if drawing courage from it. "I called you here because I have a problem, and I believe you might be uniquely positioned to solve it." "I don't understand." "No," she said. "You don't. Not yet." She turned back to face him. "How much do you know about my family, Mr. Brooks?" "Only what's in the papers. Your father founded the company. Your brother works in, I think, private equity acquisitions. And you took over as CEO after your mother passed." "That's the sanitized version," Victoria said. "The real version is uglier." She came back to the desk but didn't sit standing over him, instead arms crossed. "My father is 71 years old. He built this company from nothing, and even though he's technically retired, he still controls 41% of voting shares, which means he still controls functionally everything. He handed me operational leadership 3 years ago, but he has never, not once, told me he trusts me to keep it." "That sounds difficult," Daniel said carefully, unsure why he was being told any of this. "My brother Preston wants my job. He's wanted it since we were children, and he has spent the last 18 months quietly building support on the board, feeding. My father doubts, waiting for an opportunity to force a vote of no confidence." Her jaw tightened. "This weekend, my father is hosting the family's annual 4th of July gathering at our estate in the Hamptons. Every major shareholder, every board member, half of Preston's allies, they'll all be there. My father has made it clear that this weekend is, in his words, an evaluation. He wants proof that I am, and I quote, stable, that I have my life in order, that I am not, as he put it, still that fragile girl from 4 years ago." Daniel said nothing, sensing there was more coming, sensing it was going to be something he did not want to hear. "4 years ago," Victoria continued, and for the first time, her composure slipped just barely, just at the edges. "I had what my father refers to as a breakdown. I refer to it as a nervous system that finally gave out after 11 years of 80-hour weeks and a mother who was dying slowly of cancer while pretending she wasn't. I was hospitalized for 11 days. It was handled quietly. Very few people know. My brother is one of them, and he intends to use it this weekend in front of the entire board to prove that I am unfit to lead this company." "I'm sorry," Daniel said, and he meant it, though he still had no idea why he was hearing any of it. "I don't need your sympathy, Mr. Brooks. I need your help." She sat down, finally leaned forward, and looked at him with an expression he could only describe as desperate, in a way that someone like Victoria Hale clearly was not accustomed to feeling, let alone showing. "I need you to come to the Hamptons this weekend as my boyfriend. The silence that followed felt like it lasted a full minute, though it was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. "I'm sorry," Daniel said. "I think I misheard you." "You didn't. You want me to pretend to be your boyfriend, yes. Ms. Hale, I'm a risk analyst. I work 3 floors below the floor where people are allowed to speak to you directly. I don't even own a suit that isn't from a department store clearance rack. I'm aware of your salary, Mr. Brooks. I approved your hiring file myself 4 years ago, though you likely don't remember that. I know exactly who you are on paper. What I don't know is whether you can act like a man who is stable, devoted, and unshakable in front of people who will be looking for any crack to exploit. But I have a feeling, call it instinct, that you can. You have the kind of composure that isn't taught. It's earned. I saw it in that compliance meeting 6 months ago when you didn't flinch under pressure that made grown executives sweat through their shirts. You remember that? I remember everything, Mr. Brooks. It's a curse. Daniel sat back in the chair, his mind spinning, trying to find the logic, the trick, the catch. Why me? You could hire an actor. You could ask literally anyone else. Why an employee you barely know? Because an actor is a liability, anyone can be bought, and my brother has money to spend on exposing lies. Because anyone I know socially already knows my family, which means they already have opinions, alliances, loose tongues. And because... She paused, and for a moment something almost human crossed her face, something tired and lonely that made Daniel briefly forget she was the most powerful woman in the building. Because you have no reason to want anything from me except what I'm about to offer you. That kind of honesty is rare in my life, Mr. Brooks. Rarer than you'd think. And what exactly are you offering? Victoria opened a folder on her desk and slid it toward him. Daniel opened it and felt his breath catch in his throat. It was an offer letter. Senior Risk Officer, a title 3 levels above his current position. A salary that was nearly double what he currently made. Full benefits. A signing bonus of $15,000, and his eyes caught on this line and stayed there. A fully funded college trust for a dependent child, up to $200,000, vested immediately upon acceptance of the offer. His hands were shaking slightly as he set the folder down. This is... He couldn't finish the sentence. This is what you'll receive if you agree to accompany me this weekend and play the role convincingly enough that my father and the board believe it, Victoria said. 1 weekend, Mr. Brooks. 3 days. In exchange, your daughter's education is secured for the rest of her life, and you never have to count pennies in a grocery store again. Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of Lily's field trip permission slip. He thought of the $1,800 in rent, the $340 left over the sneakers with the poking toes, the electric bill sitting unpaid on the counter. He thought of every night he'd lain awake calculating and recalculating, trying to make numbers stretch further than numbers were willing to go. And here in front of him was a piece of paper that could make all of that disappear. I can't, he heard himself say. Victoria blinked clearly, not expecting refusal. Excuse me? I said I can't. This isn't Ms. Hale. This is lying to your family. This is lying to a room full of powerful people who could destroy me professionally if they find out, and they will find out eventually. These things always come out. And I have a daughter. I can't risk my reputation, my job, my ability to provide for her on a lie that isn't even mine. The alternative is that Preston seizes control of this company, guts the pension division to fund his own ventures, and eliminates 200 jobs in the process, including Mr. Brooks' every position in your department. Victoria's voice had gone hard again, the vulnerability sealed back behind steel. You think your job is safe. If I lose this weekend, my brother has already drafted a restructuring plan. I've seen it. Risk analysis is the first thing on his list to eliminate. He calls it redundant overhead. Daniel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. You're telling me my job is on the line either way. I'm telling you the truth, which is more than most people in this building would give you. She stood, walked around the desk, and this time sat on the edge of it closer to him, then before her voice softer, but no less urgent. I'm not asking you to fall in love with me, Mr. Brooks. I'm asking you to hold my hand at a barbecue, to sit next to me at dinner, to tell my father you care about me if he asks, and to leave on Monday with your life fundamentally, permanently changed for the better. That's all. 3 days. And if it falls apart, if your brother figures it out or your father does, then it falls apart and I lose the company and you go back to your desk on the 57th floor and neither of us is any worse off than we are right now. She met his eyes and there was something almost pleading beneath the composure now, something that made her look for just a moment less like the Ice Queen and more like a woman standing at the edge of losing everything she'd built. But if it works, Mr. Brooks, if it works, your daughter never has to worry about money again, ever. Isn't that worth 3 days of pretending? Daniel thought about it. He thought about Lily's face this morning, sleepy and trusting, asking if she could wear the dress with the stars. He thought about the years ahead of her middle school, high school, college applications, the moment she'd look at tuition numbers, and he'd have to tell her gently that some things just weren't possible for people like them. He thought about the promise he'd made at his wife's grave quietly the day of the funeral, that he would give their daughter everything, that he would not let her grow up feeling the absence of things the way he had. And he thought about how close he already was to broke, to desperate, to a version of himself, with nothing left to lose. What exactly would I have to do? He asked quietly. Victoria's shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly with what might have been relief. You'd need to be ready to leave Friday morning. We'll drive out together. Appearances matter, and arriving separately would raise questions. You'll need a few days' worth of appropriate clothing. I'll have something arranged if your own wardrobe doesn't fit the occasion. And I say that without judgment, only practicality. You'll need to learn some basic facts about me, how we supposedly met, how long we've supposedly been together. Small details that will come up in conversation. And you'll need to be prepared for my brother to test you. He will look for weaknesses. He will try to provoke you, embarrass you, catch you in a lie. You cannot let him. And your father, my father, will be more subtle and more dangerous. He doesn't shout. He watches. He asks quiet questions designed to unravel you slowly over the course of a conversation you don't realize is an interrogation until it's already over. She paused. He will be evaluating whether you're the kind of man who could handle real pressure. Which is ironically the one thing about this entire scheme that isn't actually a lie. You handle pressure very well, Mr. Brooks. I've read your personnel file. I know about your wife. I know you've raised your daughter alone for 3 years while working full-time and never once missing a deadline or a deliverable. That's not nothing. That's not weakness. My father might actually respect that if he ever saw it. Daniel felt something twist in his chest at the mention of his wife. A stranger, a powerful stranger, had read a file that reduced the worst thing that ever happened to him into a data point, a personnel note, a fact filed away for strategic use. And yet, there was no cruelty in the way she said it. If anything, her voice had gone quieter, more careful, as if she understood exactly how much that loss weighed and was trying in her own clumsy way not to add more weight to it. You really did your homework, he said. I do my homework on everything, Mr. Brooks. It's how I've survived this long in a family that would eat me alive given half a chance. He sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the offer letter, at the number that would change his daughter's entire future, at the trust fund line item that felt almost unreal, like something typed into the wrong document by mistake. If I do this, he said slowly, I need it in writing, not just the compensation. I need protection if this blows up, if I lose my job because of it. I need a severance guarantee. I need to know that whatever happens to you and your family, my daughter doesn't pay the price for a lie I told to save your company. Something shifted in Victoria's expression, surprise, and beneath it something that looked almost like respect. That's fair. I'll have legal draft and addendum today. Full severance protection regardless of outcome, non-negotiable, guaranteed by my personal signature, not just the company's. And I want to know everything. Every detail about your family, your brother, your father, anything that could blow up in my face if I don't know it going in. I'm not walking into that house blind. Agreed. And this ends Monday. Whatever happens this weekend, whatever we have to pretend, it ends Monday morning, and we go back to being what we actually are. My boss, her employee. Victoria held his gaze for a long moment, and there was something unreadable in her pale gray eyes. Something that made Daniel's stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with money or fear. Understood, she said quietly. "Monday morning it ends." He looked down at the offer letter one more time, at the number that could rewrite his daughter's entire life. And he thought about Lily's small hand in his, on the walk to the bus stop, her voice asking if she could wear the dress with the stars, completely unaware that her father was about to walk into the middle of a billion-dollar family war to protect her future. "Okay," he said, and the word felt heavier leaving his mouth than any word he could remember saying in years. "I'll do it." Victoria exhaled a long breath that seemed to release something she'd been holding since long before he'd walked into the room. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks." "Daniel," he said, "if we're going to convince your family we're together, you should probably start using my first name." For the first time since he'd entered the room, Victoria Hale actually smiled, small, brief, almost startled by itself, as if smiling were a muscle she rarely exercised. "Daniel," she repeated, testing the shape of it. "Victoria. Though in front of my father you'll want to call me Tori. It's what he's called me since I was a child. Using my full name might raise questions about how well you actually know me." "Tori," Daniel said. "Got it. We leave Friday morning, 7 a.m. from the Fifth Avenue entrance. I'll send a car. I have to arrange childcare for my daughter. She's staying with my sister in Jersey this weekend already. I'd already planned that before any of this for a completely unrelated reason, but it works out. Good. Then it's settled." Victoria stood extending her hand across the desk, and Daniel stood too, shaking it, her grip firm and cool, and entirely businesslike, betraying nothing of the fear he suspected was still churning beneath her composed exterior. "One more thing, Daniel." "Yes, my brother is not a stupid man. Dangerous men rarely are. He will smell weakness before he sees it. Whatever happens this weekend, whatever he says to provoke you, do not let him see that this is fake. Not for 1 second. Not even when we're alone in a room, because you never know who's listening in that house. Can you do that?" Daniel thought about the years he'd spent building spreadsheets that had to be perfect models that couldn't have a single miscalculated variable, presentations delivered to skeptical executives who were looking for any reason to dismiss him. He thought about the nights he'd sat in a hospital hallway, keeping his face composed for a 5-year-old daughter who needed her father to look steady, even when the whole world had just come apart. He had spent his entire adult life learning how to hold a mask in place, while everything underneath it was falling apart. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." "Then I'll see you Friday morning." Victoria walked him to the door, and just as he reached for the handle, she added almost as an afterthought, though something in her tone suggested it wasn't an afterthought at all. "Daniel, thank you for not asking me why I chose you over anyone else in this building who might have said yes more easily." He paused, hand on the handle. "Would you have told me the truth if I'd asked?" She considered the question for a moment longer than seemed necessary. "Probably not," she admitted. "Not yet, anyway." Daniel walked out of that office into the hallway, with its thick carpet and its smell of orchids and quiet money. And he felt the offer letter folder pressed against his ribs inside his jacket, like something both precious and dangerous, a promise and a threat bound together in the same piece of paper. The elevator ride down to the 57th floor felt like it took a lifetime. His reflection staring back at him in the polished steel doors, a man he barely recognized. A man who 6 hours ago had been drafting the opening line of a resignation letter in his head just in case, and who was now somehow engaged to spend the 4th of July weekend pretending to be in love with the most powerful, most feared, most guarded woman in the entire company. When he stepped off of the elevator, Gary Pruitt was waiting by the water cooler, practically vibrating with anxious curiosity. "Well, what happened? Are you fired?" Daniel looked at him, and for the first time all day felt something that might have been the beginning of a real smile tug at the corner of his mouth, though it was tangled up with something closer to dread. "No," he said. "I'm not fired." "Then what? What did she want?" Daniel thought about Lily asleep in her bed with the stuffed rabbit, unaware that her father had just agreed to walk into a house full of billionaires and lies to secure her future. He thought about the trust fund, the promotion, the severance guarantee, the word Monday, sitting in his mind like a lifeline he was already gripping too tightly. "I got a promotion," he said finally, which was true in its own strange way, even if it wasn't the whole truth, not even close. He went back to his desk. He sat down. He opened his laptop and stared at a spreadsheet full of numbers that an hour ago had represented the entire scope of his anxiety and now felt almost trivial compared to what was waiting for him on Friday morning. Outside his window, the city was already draped in preparation for the holiday flags hanging from lampposts. The distant sound of a marching band rehearsing somewhere near the park, the whole borough gearing up for a celebration of independence that felt to Daniel almost cruelly ironic, given that he had just agreed to give his up entirely, at least for 3 days, in exchange for his daughter's freedom from the kind of worry that had defined his entire adult life. He picked up his phone and texted his sister, "Hey, can you still take Lily this weekend?" "Something came up at work. Big opportunity. I'll explain when I pick her up Monday." The reply came back almost instantly. "Of course. Everything okay?" He looked at the offer letter folder sitting on his desk at the number that could change everything at the word Tory, written in his own handwriting on a sticky note stuck to the inside cover. A reminder he already knew he wouldn't need, but had written anyway because his hands had needed something to do. "Everything's fine," he typed back. Though even as he sent it, he wasn't entirely sure it was true. He had just agreed to walk into a family war disguised as a barbecue, to lie to a room full of the most powerful people in New York, to hold the hand of a woman he'd spoken to for less than 30 minutes, and pretend to the world that he loved her. Whatever was waiting for him in the Hamptons, Daniel Brooks understood sitting there at his desk, with the city humming with holiday anticipation outside his window, that his life had just changed, in a way there was no going back from, and he had exactly 3 days to learn how to become someone he had never been before, the boyfriend of Victoria Hale. Friday morning arrived with a heat that had already settled over the city by 6 a.m., thick and humming, the kind of July morning that made the sidewalks shimmer even before the sun had fully cleared the buildings. Daniel Brooks stood outside his apartment with a garment bag slung over one shoulder and a duffel bag at his feet, watching for a black car that Victoria had promised would be there at 7 sharp, and feeling for the first time in longer than he could remember something dangerously close to hope, tangled up with something closer to terror. He had spent the 2 days since that meeting in her office doing exactly what she'd instructed. He had signed the addendum her legal team drafted, full severance protection. His signature next to hers, notarized within an hour of the request, which told him more about how much she wanted this to work than anything she'd said out loud. He had memorized a folder of facts she'd sent over encrypted email. Her birthday, her favorite color, which of her father's business partners to avoid discussing politics with, the fact that her mother had loved gardenias, and that a certain wing of the estate still smelled like them because nobody had the heart to change the flowers. He had learned that Preston Hale was 36, divorced twice, and had been quietly maneuvering allies on the board for the better part of 2 years. He had learned that Victoria's father, Richard Hale, had built the company from a single office in 1987, and still at 71, believed that anyone who hadn't personally lived through a market crash didn't understand risk at all. And he had dropped Lily off at his sister's apartment in New Jersey the night before, hugging her tightly at the door, feeling the small weight of her arms around his neck, and thinking with a fierceness that surprised him that whatever waited for him in the Hamptons, it was worth it, if it meant she never had to worry the way he worried. "You're being weird," his sister Carol had said, studying his face in the doorway. "What kind of work trip requires a garment bag and this much stress sweat?" "It's a big deal, Carol. I can't really explain it right now." "Are you in trouble?" "No. The opposite, actually. I think." He'd kissed Lily's head one more time. "I'll call you Sunday night." Now, standing on the sidewalk, with the sun already baking through his one good shirt, he watched a sleek black Escalade pull up to the curb and the rear window rolled down to reveal Victoria Hale's face, sunglasses pushed up into her dark hair, looking somehow both more relaxed and more coiled than she had in her office. "You're on time," she said as the driver got out to take his bags. "I appreciate punctuality. I figured showing up late to fake date a CEO would be a bad first impression." Something flickered at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Get in, Daniel." He climbed into the back seat beside her, and the door shut with a soft, expensive sound, sealing them into cool, quiet air that smelled faintly of leather and something floral he couldn't place. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the thickening holiday traffic, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "How are you feeling?" Victoria finally asked, not looking at him, her eyes on the window. "Honestly? Like I'm about to walk into an exam I didn't study enough for." "You studied plenty. I sent you 3 pages of material, and you responded to every follow-up question correctly within an hour. That's more preparation than most people put into things that actually matter to them. This matters to me. My daughter's future is riding on it." Victoria turned to look at him then, and something in her expression softened, just slightly. "Fair enough. Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. Why does your father get to decide whether you keep the company you've been running successfully for 3 years? If the numbers are good, and I've seen the numbers." "Victoria, I run risk models on half the divisions. Why does one bad weekend at a barbecue get to undo 3 years of proof?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching the skyline shrink behind them in the rear window. "Because my father doesn't believe numbers are the whole story," she said finally. "He believes that anyone can manufacture a good quarter if they're desperate enough or ruthless enough. What he actually wants to know is whether I'm the kind of person who can be trusted with something for the next 30 years, not just the next 3. And in his mind, a person's private life is the truest test of that. A person who can't hold together a relationship, a family, a home. How can they be trusted to hold together a company with 12,000 employees? That's an old-fashioned way to run a business. My father is an old-fashioned man, wearing a very expensive suit. He didn't get where he is by being modern. He got there by being suspicious of everyone, including especially his own children." She looked down at her hands folded tightly in her lap. "When I had my breakdown 4 years ago, he didn't visit me in the hospital once. Not once in 11 days. He sent flowers. Gardenia's actually my mother's favorite, which I've never decided was thoughtful or just tone-deaf. But he didn't come. And when I got out, the first thing he said to me wasn't, 'Are you okay?' It was, 'Does anyone outside the family know?' Dian." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, an old familiar ache, not for himself this time, but for her. "That's a hell of a thing to hear from your own father. It's the only kind of thing Richard Hale knows how to say." She looked at him, then something raw flickering behind the composed exterior. "Which is why this weekend matters more than you probably understand. It's not just about the company, Daniel. It's about proving to a man who has never once told me he's proud of me that I am not the broken thing he's always suspected I am." The car fell silent again, the highway stretching out ahead of them, the city giving way slowly to the flatter, greener landscape of Long Island, and Daniel found himself looking at Victoria Hale. Tori, he reminded himself. Tori in front of the family. Not as the ice queen from the elevator, not as a name on an offer letter, but as a person carrying something heavy and lonely that had nothing to do with money at all. "For what it's worth," he said quietly. "You don't seem broken to me. You seem like someone who's had to be strong for a very long time without anyone ever asking if she was okay." Victoria looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her pale gray eyes, and then she turned back to the window, and neither of them spoke again for almost 20 minutes. The Hale estate, when they finally arrived, took Daniel's breath away in a way he wasn't prepared for, despite everything he'd read and heard. It sat behind iron gates that opened automatically as the car approached a long gravel driveway lined with old oak trees leading up to a house that looked less like a home and more like something out of a magazine spread about old American money. White columns, wraparound porches, a lawn so perfectly manicured it looked almost artificial, and beyond it, the glint of ocean visible through a gap in the trees. "This is where you grew up?" Daniel asked, unable to keep the disbelief out of his voice. "This is where I grew up," Victoria confirmed. "Every 4th of July since I was born. My mother used to say this house had more history than the country it was celebrating." The car pulled to a stop in front of the main entrance, and before the driver had even finished opening the door, Daniel felt Victoria's hand close around his, not gently, not romantically, but with a kind of firm, deliberate pressure, like someone bracing for impact. "Remember," she said quietly, not looking at him. From this moment until we leave Monday, we are Daniel and Tori, not Mr. Brooks and Ms. Hale, not employee and employer. Whatever happens in there, you don't break character. Not for a second. Understood. And Daniel, whatever my brother says to you, however he tries to provoke you, do not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He feeds on reactions. It's the only currency he understands. Daniel nodded, and together they stepped out of the car into the thick July heat. Hand in hand, walking up the wide stone steps toward the front door, which opened before they even reached it to reveal a household staff member who greeted Victoria with practiced warmth and eyed Daniel with unmistakable curiosity. Ms. Hale, your father is expecting you both in the garden. Thank you, Marcus. They walked through a foyer that could have swallowed Daniel's entire apartment twice, over past oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and a sweeping staircase that curved up into shadow and out through a set of French doors into a garden that opened onto a lawn stretching all the way to a private stretch of beach. A long table had already been set up beneath a white tent staff, moving quietly among it, preparing for what was clearly going to be an enormous gathering, and standing near the edge of the lawn, silhouetted against the ocean glare, was a tall silver-haired man in a crisp white shirt, watching them approach with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. Victoria, the man said as they reached him. His voice deep and measured, carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent 50 years never once needing to raise it. You're late. Traffic on the expressway, Dad. You know how the holiday weekend is. Richard Hale's eyes moved from his daughter to Daniel, sweeping over him with an assessment so thorough it felt almost physical, like being measured for a suit by someone who intended to find fault with the fabric. And this is the boyfriend. Dad, this is Daniel Brooks. Daniel, my father, Richard Hale. Daniel extended his hand, forcing his voice to stay steady, despite the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. Mr. Hale, it's an honor to finally meet you. Richard shook his hand once firmly, his grip testing rather than welcoming. Brooks, what is it you do exactly? I'm a risk analyst at Hale Global, sir. Something shifted in Richard's expression, surprise, and beneath it something sharper. You work for my daughter. I do, sir. And how long have the two of you been? He gestured vaguely between them, the word clearly distasteful to him. Involved. Victoria answered before Daniel could, her hand tightening almost imperceptibly around his. Almost 8 months, Dad. We kept it quiet, obviously, because of the reporting structure. I didn't want anyone thinking I was showing favoritism. 8 months, Richard repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Daniel again this time, with the particular scrutiny of a man looking for cracks. And you never once mentioned him. I'm mentioning him now. The tension in the air was almost tangible, and Daniel felt the full weight of what he'd agreed to settle onto his shoulders in that moment. Not an abstract risk anymore. Not a hypothetical scenario discussed in the safety of a glass office 60 floors above Manhattan, but a real man with real suspicion standing 3 feet away from him, already looking for the seams in a story that had been stitched together only 2 days ago. Well? Richard said, finally, his tone giving nothing away. I suppose we'll have plenty of time this weekend to get acquainted, won't we, Mr. Brooks? I'm looking forward to it, sir. Are you? It wasn't a question so much as a challenge, delivered flat and unreadable, and Richard held Daniel's gaze for one long, uncomfortable beat before turning back toward the tent, calling over his shoulder as he walked away. Preston's already here. He's been asking about your new arrangement since Wednesday, Victoria. I'd brace yourself. As if summoned by the mention of his name, a man emerged from beneath the white tent, tall like his father, with the same sharp bone structure as Victoria, but none of her restraint, dressed in a linen shirt that looked deliberately, expensively casual, a drink already in his hand despite the early hour. Preston Hale's eyes found his sister first, then slid to Daniel, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. Well, well, Preston said, crossing the lawn toward them, with the loose, confident gait of a man who had never once in his life doubted his own place in a room. So the rumors are true. The Ice Queen has a heartbeat after all. "Hello, Preston. And this must be the mystery man." Preston stopped in front of Daniel, looking him over with the same appraising sweep his father had used, but with a cruelty layered underneath that Richards had lacked. "Daniel is at Victoria's assistant told me you work in risk. Analyst level. That's—" He paused, savoring the word modest. "It's honest work," Daniel said evenly, refusing to let his voice betray anything. "I'm sure it is." Preston's smile widened. "Tell me, Daniel, how does a risk analyst afford to keep up with my sister's tastes? I hear she likes the Hamptons private jets, $6,000 dinners. Quite a lifestyle for someone reading spreadsheets all day." "I'm not with your sister for her money, Preston. I'm with her because—" Daniel paused, and in that pause, he found himself reaching for something true, something he didn't have to fabricate because he had spent the last 2 days actually observing Victoria Hale in ways that went beyond the performance they were both putting on. "Because she works harder than anyone I've ever met, and she carries more weight than anyone should have to carry alone. And somehow, she still shows up every single day and does the job right. That's not something you fake." The lawn went quiet for a beat. Even Preston momentarily seemed thrown by the sincerity in Daniel's voice, something he clearly hadn't expected from a man he'd assumed would fold under pressure or stammer through a scripted answer. Victoria's hand tightened around Daniel's, and when he glanced at her, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not gratitude exactly, but something close to it, something startled and unguarded. "How poetic," Preston said, finally recovering his smirk, though it landed with slightly less force than before. Careful sister, this one might actually believe his own performance. "It's not a performance, Preston," Victoria said coolly. "But I understand why the concept confuses you. You've never managed a genuine relationship in your life. 2 divorces in 6 years. How's that working out for your credibility with the board?" Preston's jaw tightened, the smirk faltering for the first time. "At least I don't need to import my relationships from the mailroom." "He's not from the mailroom. He's a senior member of my risk division, and he's brilliant at his job, which is more than anyone's ever said about your division's numbers. We'll see whose numbers hold up this weekend," Preston said, his voice suddenly losing its playful edge, something colder sliding underneath. "Dad's asked for a full financial review before the board meeting Monday. Funny how things come to light at the most inconvenient times." "Is that a threat, Preston?" "It's a fact, Victoria. Facts don't need to be threatening to be dangerous." He looked at Daniel one more time, something calculating behind his eyes, and then turned and walked back toward the tent without another word, leaving a silence behind him that felt heavier than anything that had come before it. "What was that about?" Daniel asked quietly, once Preston was out of earshot. "I don't know," Victoria admitted, and for the first time since Daniel had met her, she looked genuinely rattled. "But I don't like it. Preston doesn't make idle comments. If he's mentioning a financial review, it's because he's planning to use it against me somehow." "Against you or against the company? With Preston, there's rarely a difference." The rest of the afternoon unfolded in a strange, exhausting rhythm of performance and pause, small talk with board members and their spouses who arrived in staggered waves throughout the day. Each one requiring a fresh round of introductions, a fresh recitation of the fabricated story of how Daniel and Victoria had met. A compliance meeting. She'd decided close enough to the truth that neither of them would trip over the details, embellished with a detail about him staying late to help her review a report, and the two of them ordering takeout at midnight and realizing they had more to talk about than just numbers. By late afternoon, Daniel had shaken more hands than he could count, absorbed more curious, calculating glances than he cared to think about, and performed the role of devoted boyfriend with an ease that surprised even him, resting his hand at the small of Victoria's back during conversations, laughing convincingly at anecdotes he'd never actually heard before, catching her eye across the lawn in moments that were supposed to look like private affection, but were really just two people checking in silently, asking each other, "Are we still okay? Is this still working?" It was during a lull in the afternoon, while Victoria was pulled away by a board member's wife, eager to discuss charity gala logistics, that Richard Hale found Daniel standing alone near the edge of the tent, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand, and sat down across from him at one of the small round tables without waiting for an invitation. "Mr. Brooks. Mr. Hale. Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Daniel set down his glass and followed the older man across the lawn away from the crowd toward the edge of the property where the manicured grass gave way to dune grass and the sound of the ocean grew louder. "You'll forgive an old man's directness," Richard said, hands clasped behind his back as they walked, "but I don't have the patience left in my life for pleasantries I don't mean. My daughter has never brought a man to this house, not once, not in 34 years. She dated a hedge fund manager for 2 years in her 20s, and I never once met him because she said, and I quote, 'There was nothing worth introducing.' So you'll understand my curiosity about what's different this time." Daniel chose his words carefully, aware that every syllable was being weighed. "I think, sir, that most of the men your daughter has dated were interested in what she represented, rather than who she actually is. I'm not saying that to flatter myself. I'm saying it because I think it's true, and I think she spent most of her adult life being lonely in rooms full of people who wanted something from her." Richard stopped walking and turned to look at him, something unreadable passing across his weathered face. "And what do you want from her, Mr. Brooks? Nothing she hasn't already offered." "That's a very careful answer. It's an honest one." Richard studied him for a long moment, the ocean wind pulling at his silver hair, and then he resumed walking slower this time. "My wife died 4 years ago. Cancer. Slow, cruel thing that took 18 months to finish what it started. During that time, my daughter ran this company almost single-handedly, while also managing her mother's care because He paused, something bitter crossing his face. "Because I couldn't bring myself to be in that hospital room more than an hour at a time. I told myself it was because someone needed to keep the business running. The truth is, I was a coward. And when Victoria finally collapsed under the weight of it all, I didn't see a daughter who had given everything she had to 2 dying things at once, her mother and this company. I saw a liability. I saw weakness. And I have spent every day since then trying to justify that judgment to myself, because the alternative is admitting that I failed her when she needed me most, and I am far too old and far too proud to admit something like that out loud." Daniel said nothing, sensing that the older man wasn't finished, that something long buried was finally working its way to the surface. "Preston has spent 2 years feeding me stories about her instability, her fragility, and I have let him because it was easier than confronting my own guilt." Richard stopped again, looking out at the ocean, his jaw working. "I don't know if you're real, Mr. Brooks, or if this is some elaborate arrangement designed to save her from a board vote she's terrified of losing. I'm not a stupid man. I've built empires by knowing when I'm being managed." He turned to look at Daniel directly, his eyes sharp despite his age. "But I will tell you this. If you are real, if you are what you appear to be, then you are the first good thing that has happened to my daughter in longer than I care to admit. And if you're not real, if this is a performance staged to manipulate an old man into changing his vote, I promise you I will find out, and there will be consequences for both of you that neither of you will enjoy." Daniel felt his pulse hammering in his throat, but he held the older man's gaze without flinching, drawing on every ounce of composure he'd built over 3 years of holding himself together for his daughter's sake. "Mr. Hale, I understand your skepticism. I would be skeptical too in your position. All I can tell you is that I've watched your daughter this week in a way that I don't think many people get to see her. I've seen her exhausted at 11 at night, still answering emails because she doesn't trust anyone else to catch the details. I've seen her flinch just barely every time your name comes up in conversation, because some part of her is still trying to earn something from you that she should have already had a long time ago. Whatever you decide about me, sir, I hope you decide to actually look at her. Not the version of her that exists in your head from 4 years ago. The version standing in front of you right now." Richard was silent for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but cracked slightly like ice under pressure that hadn't broken yet, but was no longer entirely solid. You're either the most convincing liar I've ever met, Mr. Brooks, or you actually mean that. I mean it. We'll see. Richard turned and began walking back toward the tent, and then paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Dinner is at 7. Family only tonight, Victoria, Preston, myself, and apparently you. Wear something that isn't a suit. This isn't the office. He walked away, leaving Daniel standing alone at the edge of the dune grass, the ocean wind pulling at his shirt, his heart still hammering from the weight of everything he'd just said. Words that had started as strategy and ended somewhere in the middle as something that felt uncomfortably close to the truth. Dinner that evening took place in a smaller dining room at the back of the house, a long table set for 4 beneath a low chandelier. The windows open to let in the cooling evening air and the distant sound of waves. Victoria sat beside Daniel, her hand finding his. Beneath the table almost the moment they sat down, and Daniel understood, without her saying anything, that she needed the contact not for the performance, but for herself. "So?" Preston said, swirling wine in his glass, watching Daniel with the particular hunger of a predator who'd sensed weakness and intended to press on it. "Dad tells me you two have been together 8 months. That's quite a while to keep a secret in an office where everyone knows everyone's business." "We're private people," Daniel said evenly. "Private, right." Preston set down his glass. "Tell me, Daniel, where did you go to school?" "State University. Finance degree. Not exactly the pedigree Victoria usually goes for. Her ex went to Wharton. Before that, Yale." "Preston," Victoria said sharply, "that's enough. I'm just making conversation, sister. Getting to know your new boyfriend." Preston leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. "So tell me what happens to a risk analyst's career when his relationship with the CEO inevitably falls apart. Because these things always fall apart, don't they? When the power imbalance is this severe, do you get a severance package for that too?" Daniel felt the barb land exactly where it was meant to, dangerously close to the truth, close enough that his pulse spiked, but he kept his face perfectly still, the same composure he'd learned in a hospital hallway years ago, when the truth had been far worse than anything Preston could invent. "I'm not with Victoria for career advancement, Preston. If anything, dating my boss is professionally reckless. I did it anyway because some things matter more than career strategy." He looked directly at Preston, letting a note of quiet steel enter his voice for the first time. "You clearly don't understand that concept, given that you've apparently spent the last 2 years plotting against your own sister, instead of building something you could actually be proud of." The table went silent. Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Preston's face flushed, the smirk finally fully gone. "You don't know anything about what I've built," Preston said, his voice dropping into something colder. "I know enough. I know that people who spend their energy tearing others down usually do it because they don't trust what they'd find if they had to stand on their own accomplishments instead." Daniel held his gaze, refusing to break feeling. Victoria's hand tightened around his beneath the table, feeling her lean almost imperceptibly closer to him, as if drawing strength from the fact that someone was finally, for the first time in years, standing beside her, instead of watching from a safe distance. Preston stood up so abruptly his chair scraped hard against the floor, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with something that had moved past mockery into genuine anger. "You have no idea what you've walked into," he said, low and dangerous, looking not at Daniel, but at Victoria. "Enjoy your little performance while it lasts, sister. Monday's coming faster than you think." And he turned and walked out of the dining room without another word, leaving his wine glass still half full, and the air thick with something unspoken and threatening. Richard set down his fork slowly, looking between his daughter and Daniel, with an expression that had shifted entirely from where it had been that afternoon. "Well," he said quietly, "that was illuminating." "Dad, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for—" "Don't apologize, Victoria." Richard's eyes moved to Daniel, something almost approving flickering across his weathered face. "Your brother has spent 2 years learning exactly which buttons to push in every room he enters. I've watched grown men twice his age wither under that particular tactic. You didn't wither, Mr. Brooks. That's noteworthy." "I've had practice holding steady under pressure, sir." "Yes?" Richard said, slowly studying him. "I imagine you have." He turned his attention back to his plate, though something in his posture had changed, some wall lowered by a fraction. "Finish your dinner. Tomorrow's the main event. The full board arrives for the barbecue at noon, and I expect Preston to be considerably less subtle than he was tonight." After dinner, when they finally retreated to the guest wing where Victoria had arranged for Daniel to stay in the room adjoining her own connected, she'd explained earlier, by a shared sitting room close enough to maintain appearances for the staff, but with separate bedrooms and locking doors. She stood in the doorway between the two rooms for a long moment, watching him set down his bag. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Push back on Preston like that. It could have made things worse." "He was baiting me. I wasn't going to let him win by staying quiet. Still, thank you." She hesitated, arms crossed over her chest, something vulnerable in the set of her shoulders that Daniel hadn't seen since the elevator glimpses of years ago, since the rumor of the Ice Queen had first calcified in his mind. "My father seemed different with you tonight. Softer. I haven't seen that look on his face in years. He's scared, Victoria. Underneath all that control, he's scared he failed you when your mother was dying, and Preston's been feeding on that fear for 2 years. I think some part of him wants a reason to stop believing Preston's version of things. You noticed all that in one afternoon. I've spent a lot of years learning to read people who are trying not to be read. Comes with the territory of holding a family together alone." He looked at her, something honest passing between them that neither of them had planned for. "For what it's worth, Victoria, the things I said to Preston at dinner, about you working harder than anyone I've ever met, about you carrying more than you should have to alone. I wasn't performing that. I meant every word of it." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the dim light of the sitting room, and something in her expression seemed to shift some careful wall, lowering by a fraction the way her father's had at dinner. "Get some sleep, Daniel," she said finally, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Tomorrow's going to be worse. Preston's threat about Monday, I don't like it. I think he's planning something bigger than a dinner ambush, and I need you sharp when it comes. I'll be ready." She lingered in the doorway a moment longer, as if there was something else she wanted to say, and then she simply nodded and disappeared into her room, leaving Daniel alone in the quiet, unfamiliar space, the sound of the ocean drifting faintly through the open window, his mind turning over everything that had happened that day. Richard's confession at the dune grass, Preston's parting threat, the strange, unexpected warmth that had passed between himself and Victoria in the doorway, and beneath all of it, a growing unease that whatever Preston was planning for the board meeting on Monday was going to be far more dangerous than either of them had prepared for. Daniel woke before dawn to the sound of gulls and the strange, disorienting sensation of not knowing for a moment where he was. Then it came back to him in a rush: the estate, the dinner, Preston's parting threat, Richard's confession at the dune grass, and he lay there in the unfamiliar bed staring at the ceiling, running through everything that had happened in the last 24 hours, like he used to run through risk models at his desk, searching for the variable that didn't add up. Preston's threat kept circling back to him. "Enjoy your little performance while it lasts. Monday's coming faster than you think." It wasn't the kind of thing a man said when he was simply annoyed at being outmaneuvered at a dinner table. It was the kind of thing a man said when he already held a card he hadn't played yet. He got up, showered, dressed in the clothes Victoria's assistant had quietly arranged for him, a soft blue button-down tailored just enough to fit, without looking like it belonged to someone else's life, and found Victoria already awake in the small shared sitting room, sitting at a writing desk, with her laptop open. Dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept much either. "You're up early," he said. "I never sleep well the night before the barbecue. Too many years of bad memories stacked on top of each other." She didn't look up from the screen. "I've been going through Preston's division reports since 5 a.m. Something's been bothering me since dinner." "What kind of something?" "Preston runs our private equity acquisitions arm. 2 years ago, he pitched a crypto infrastructure venture to the board, a blockchain settlement platform he swore was going to modernize half our back-office operations. The board approved $40 million in funding. 18 months later, He announced the venture had failed. Technology didn't scale. Market conditions shifted all the usual language people use when they need to bury something without anyone asking too many questions. And you believed him. At the time, I had no reason not to. The venture reported to him directly audited by an outside firm he selected, and I was buried under my own division's crisis that quarter. But last night, after he stormed out of dinner, something kept nagging at me. So I pulled the original venture filings. She turned the laptop toward him, and Daniel leaned in, scanning the numbers on the screen with the practiced eye of a man who spent his life finding the places where numbers didn't behave the way they were supposed to. "These write down figures," Daniel said slowly, pointing at a column near the bottom of the report. "This is the total loss reported to the board. 38 million officially. 2 million was recovered in liquidated assets. And this," Daniel said, scrolling further down, his finger landing on a smaller buried line item labeled Pension Reallocation Bridge Facility. "What is this?" Victoria frowned, leaning closer. "I don't know. I've never seen this line before. It's not in the original filing I remember reviewing. It says here 40 million was moved from the Employee Pension Trust into what's labeled a bridge facility to cover operational continuity during the crypto venture's wind-down. That's not a write-down. That's a transfer. And it happened 3 weeks before the failure was announced to the board." Daniel felt his pulse quicken, the old familiar rush of finding an inconsistency buried in a spreadsheet, except this time, the stakes weren't a quarterly report. They were real people's retirement savings. "Victoria, if I'm reading this correctly, your brother didn't lose $40 million in a failed crypto venture. He used the failed venture as cover to move $40 million of pension money somewhere else and reported it to the board as an investment loss, so nobody would ever go looking for where it actually went." Victoria's face had gone pale. Her hand pressed flat against the desk, as if steadying herself. "That's embezzlement. That's not a bad business decision, that's a felony." "If I'm right, yes. But I need more than this one line item to prove it. This could be a labeling error, a legitimate accounting maneuver that just looks suspicious out of context. I need to see where that 40 million actually went. Bank records wire transfers something that shows the money left the pension trust and landed somewhere Preston controls. How do we get that without tipping him off?" Daniel thought for a moment, his mind already working through the problem the way it worked through every problem, methodically, carefully looking for the safest path through a minefield. "Does the company still use the same custodial bank for pension trust accounts?" "Yes, First Continental." Then somewhere in the compliance archive there should be a custodial statement showing the outbound transfer banks don't just let $40 million disappear without a paper trail, even a hidden one. If Preston structured this as a bridge facility, there's likely a shell entity or holding company that received the funds. Find that entity and you find where the money actually is. And if we find it before Monday's board meeting, then Preston doesn't get to accuse you of instability in front of that board. You get to accuse him of criminal fraud." Daniel looked at her, feeling something shift in the room, the fear of the last 2 days sharpening into something closer to purpose. "This isn't about surviving a barbecue anymore, Victoria. This is about protecting real people's retirements from a man who's already stolen from them once and clearly isn't finished." Victoria closed her laptop slowly, her jaw set with a new cold determination that Daniel recognized from her office 2 days ago, the same expression she must have worn 100 times running board meetings, negotiating deals, holding a company together through sheer force of will. "Then we need access to the compliance archive without anyone at this house knowing what we're looking for. And we need it before Monday." "Can you access it remotely?" "Not without triggering a login alert that goes to IT security, which reports unfortunately to Preston's office as part of his acquisitions oversight." She rubbed her temples. "He restructured reporting lines 18 months ago. I signed off on it without realizing what I was giving him access to." "Then we need someone else's credentials. Someone who wouldn't raise suspicion. Or we need physical access to something here at the house." Victoria's eyes lifted to meet his, something calculating and slightly reckless flickering behind them. "Preston keeps a private office in the East Wing. He's had it since college. Dad never converted it because Mom wanted it left as his study. If there's a hard copy of anything, or if he's stupid enough to keep his laptop unlocked over a holiday weekend, it would be there. You're talking about breaking into your brother's office. I'm talking about protecting 12,000 employees' retirement savings from a man who's already proven he'll lie to a room full of board members without blinking. She stood up, smoothing down the front of her shirt, some of the exhaustion from moments ago replaced by a hard, focused energy. But not now. Not during the barbecue with half the board wandering the grounds. Tonight after everyone's gone to bed. Can you do that with me? Daniel thought about Lily, about the offer letter, about the promise of Monday morning, ending all of this, and then he thought about the pension trust line item, about real employees who had worked their whole lives trusting that their retirement money was safe, about a man like Preston, who clearly believed he was untouchable because his last name was Hale. Yes, he said, I'll do it. The barbecue began at noon exactly, and by 12:30, the lawn was crowded with more wealth and power than Daniel had ever stood in the same space with in his entire life. Board members and their spouses, a state senator who arrived by private helicopter that landed on a stretch of lawn, cordoned off for exactly that purpose, executives from 3 other Fortune 500 companies who apparently considered the Hale family's 4th of July gathering an unmissable networking event disguised as a holiday party. Daniel stayed close to Victoria through most of it, his hand at the small of her back, his laugh timed to land at the right moments in conversations about golf handicaps and offshore tax strategies. He understood better than most of the men discussing them, though he kept that particular fact to himself, playing instead the role of the quietly competent boyfriend who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. It was mid-afternoon during a lull near the Raw Bar that Preston found them again, this time flanked by 2 men Daniel didn't recognize, board members, judging by the deference with which the catering staff treated them. Daniel. Preston said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a man performing civility for an audience. Gentlemen, this is my sister's new boyfriend. Works in her risk division. Analyst level. He said the word analyst the way some men said the names of diseases. One of the board members, a heavy-set man with a red, sunburned face, chuckled. A risk analyst dating the CEO. That's not a conflict of interest concern, Victoria. We've had legal review the arrangement thoroughly, Victoria said smoothly, not missing a beat. Daniel has no involvement in any decisions affecting his own compensation or advancement. It's all handled through an independent committee. How very corporate of you both, Preston said, smiling. Very buttoned up, very careful. He turned to Daniel. Tell me, Daniel, since we're all being so transparent, what's your read on the pension fund's current allocation strategy? Since you're a risk analyst, surely you have opinions about how well the fund is being managed. Daniel felt the trap. The moment it closed around him, understood instantly that Preston was testing whether Daniel knew anything, fishing to see if his sister had brought her fake boyfriend into something he shouldn't be near. He kept his expression perfectly neutral, drawing on years of practice holding a poker face through compliance meetings that could end careers. I don't have visibility into pension allocation strategy, Preston. That's several levels above my role. I stick to the accounts I'm assigned. Modest, Preston said, though something in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. How refreshing in a family full of people who think they know everything about everything. He raised his glass slightly toward Daniel, a gesture that looked friendly, and felt to Daniel like a blade being tested against skin. To staying in your lane. To staying informed enough to know when something's out of alignment, Daniel replied evenly, holding Preston's gaze. Even when it's outside my lane. The red-faced board member laughed again, oblivious to the current running beneath the exchange. I like him, Victoria. Sharp. He clapped Preston on the shoulder. Preston, you should hire people who talk like that instead of the yes men you usually surround yourself with. Preston's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment, just a moment, Daniel saw something flash behind his eyes that looked less like arrogance and more like genuine alarm, the look of a man who suddenly briefly wondered if the ground beneath him was less solid than he'd believed. If you'll excuse us, Preston said, recovering quickly. I need to steal my father for a moment before the fireworks discussion starts. He walked away with the 2 board members, but not before shooting one last look back at Daniel, recalculating the mockery from the last 2 days, replaced by something more careful. "He's rattled," Victoria murmured once they were alone again. "Good. Rattled men make mistakes." Daniel glanced toward the house, toward the east wing, visible above the tree line. Tonight. The afternoon stretched into a long, humid evening, the barbecue slowly transitioning into a formal dinner beneath the tent as the sun began its slow descent toward the ocean, painting the sky in the kind of orange and violet that Daniel would have found beautiful under any other circumstances, but which now only reminded him of how little time remained before Monday. Richard Hale gave a short toast to the assembled board and family, thanking them for their years of partnership, his eyes lingering on Victoria for a beat longer than necessary. Something unspoken passing between father and daughter that Daniel couldn't quite interpret. By the time the last guests had departed and the staff had begun clearing the grounds under the glow of string lights, it was nearly midnight, and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a place that had spent all day performing and was finally allowed to rest. Victoria found Daniel in the shared sitting room a little after 1 in the morning, dressed in dark clothes, her hair pulled back, looking less like the Ice Queen CEO, and more like a woman about to do something dangerous and necessary in equal measure. Everyone's asleep. Staff's gone for the night, except the 2 on overnight security, and they patrol the perimeter, not the interior halls. She held up a small flashlight, its beam narrow and red-tinted. Preston sleeps like the dead when he's been drinking, and he was matching Dad glass for glass at dinner. And if we're wrong about that, then we improvise. She looked at him, something serious and slightly frightened beneath the determination. "Daniel, I need to be honest with you. This isn't part of what I asked you to do. Pretending to be my boyfriend is one thing. Breaking into my brother's private office to find evidence of a federal crime is something else entirely. If you want to stop here, I understand." Daniel thought about it for exactly as long as it took to remember the pension line item on that screen this morning, the number 40 million sitting there disguised as a business failure representing retirement funds for people who had spent decades trusting a system that had apparently been quietly gutted by a man who golfed with senators. "I'm not stopping now," he said. "Let's go." They moved through the darkened house together, Victoria leading her memory of the estate's layout, guiding them silently past the grand staircase, down a side hallway lined with more oil paintings of ancestors who had never once had to worry about pension funds or board votes, toward a heavy wooden door at the end of the east wing that Victoria opened with a key she'd apparently kept since childhood. Preston's study smelled like old leather and expensive cologne, dominated by a large mahogany desk and shelves lined with law books and financial journals that looked to Daniel's eye mostly unread. Victoria went straight for the desk, while Daniel checked the door ears, straining for any sound of movement in the hallway. "Locked," Victoria whispered, tugging at the top drawer. "Try the bottom one. People always think the top drawer needs the better lock." She tried it, and it slid open silently, revealing a laptop and a slim leather folder. Daniel crossed the room quickly, and together they opened the folder first. Victoria angling the red flashlight beam over the papers inside, while Daniel scanned them with the same fast, practiced eye he used on spreadsheets at his desk. "There." He set his finger, landing on a page near the back. "Windward Capital Holdings. Registered in Delaware, formed 18 months ago. Same month the crypto venture supposedly started failing." He flipped to the next page. "And here's the wire authorization. 40 million from the Pension Trust Bridge Facility directly into a Windward Capital account. Signed by Preston Hale, countersigned by," he squinted at the signature, "someone named Gerald Voss, Chief Compliance Officer per the letterhead." "Gerald Voss reports to Preston," Victoria said grimly. "I should have known Preston wouldn't have moved $40 million without buying someone else's silence." Daniel pulled his phone from his pocket and began photographing every page, methodically careful to capture each document in full, his hands steady despite the adrenaline hammering through his veins. "This is enough to prove the transfer happened, but it doesn't prove where the money went after it landed in Windward Capital. If Preston's smart, he's already laundered it through 2 or 3 more shell layers by now." "Check the laptop," Victoria said, nodding toward it. If he's arrogant enough to leave documents like this in an unlocked drawer, maybe he's arrogant enough to leave the laptop logged in too. Daniel opened the laptop and the screen flickered to life without asking for a password, exactly as Victoria had predicted. Preston Hale apparently believed so completely in his own untouchability that basic security had never occurred to him as necessary within the walls of his family's estate. Daniel navigated quickly through the file directory, his heart beat loud in his own ears, until he found a folder labeled simply WC Holdings Internal, and inside it a spreadsheet that made his stomach turn cold. "Victoria, look at this." She leaned over his shoulder, and together they scanned a document that laid out in Preston's own meticulous financial handwriting a full accounting of the $40 million, $12 million transferred to a personal investment account in the Cayman Islands, $8 million used to purchase a controlling stake in a private aviation company registered under Preston's ex-wife's maiden name, and the remaining $20 million sitting in a series of accounts labeled only by number, presumably waiting to be moved further once the pension loss had been fully absorbed and forgotten by the board. "He stole from 12,000 employees to buy himself a plane company," Victoria said, her voice shaking with a fury Daniel hadn't heard from her before, cold and controlled, but unmistakably furious. People who spent their entire careers trusting this company with their retirement, and he treated it like his personal slush fund. "We need to copy this drive," Daniel said, already scanning the desk for a way to do it discreetly. "There in the drawer, is that an external drive?" Victoria pulled it out, a small encrypted USB device, and Daniel plugged it into the laptop, initiating a transfer of the entire WC Holdings folder, along with everything else he could find related to the pension trust and the Windward Capital shell. The progress bar crawled agonizingly slowly across the screen, each second stretching unbearably as both of them strained to listen for any sound in the hallway outside. "Come on," Victoria whispered, willing the transfer to finish faster. It was at 43% when they heard it, footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, coming closer. Daniel's blood ran cold. He looked at Victoria, and without a word they both moved Victoria, killing the flashlight beam, while Daniel silently closed the laptop halfway, just enough to dim the screen glow without stopping the transfer, and they pressed themselves into the shadow beside a tall bookshelf as the footsteps stopped just outside the study door. The door handle turned. For one horrifying second, Daniel was certain they'd been caught, certain that Preston was about to walk in and find his sister and her fake boyfriend standing over his stolen laptop with an evidence drive plugged into it, certain that whatever fragile trust Richard had begun extending toward him was about to collapse into something far worse than mere suspicion. But the door didn't open. The footsteps paused for a moment longer, and then, to Daniel's overwhelming relief, continued past, fading down the hallway toward what he guessed was the bathroom at the far end of the wing. "That was too close." Victoria breathed, her hand pressed flat against her chest. The transfer finished a moment later, 98%, 99-100, and Daniel pulled the drive free, closing the laptop exactly as they'd found it, sliding the leather folder back into the drawer in precisely the position it had occupied before, while Victoria smoothed the desk surface to erase any sign of disturbance. "We need to get out of here," Daniel whispered, and Victoria nodded, leading him back out into the hallway, both of them moving with the careful, silent urgency of people who understood exactly how much was riding on the next 60 seconds. They made it back to the shared sitting room without incident, and once the door was locked behind them, Victoria sank into a chair. The drive clutched tightly in her hand, her whole body trembling with the release of adrenaline that had been holding her rigid for the last 20 minutes. "We have it," she said, half disbelieving. "We actually have it. We have enough to prove wire transfers and shell entities. What we need now is somewhere safe to verify all of this before Monday, and someone who can confirm the compliance officer's signature is genuine and not forged." "I know someone," Victoria said slowly, a plan already forming behind her eyes. "An outside forensic accountant my mother used years ago, completely independent from the company, no ties to Preston's division whatsoever. If I call her first thing tomorrow, she can verify everything and prepare a report we can present to the full board Monday morning." "That doesn't leave much time." "It doesn't need to," We just need enough to be undeniable." Victoria looked up at him. Something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not just gratitude, not just relief, but something deeper, something that looked almost like awe. "Daniel, you didn't have to do any of this. This isn't hand-holding at a barbecue. This is real risk, real danger, and you walked into it without hesitating." "I told you already," Daniel said quietly, sitting down across from her. "This isn't just about you and your family anymore. It's about the people whose retirement money got stolen so your brother could buy himself an airplane. I couldn't walk away from that even if I wanted to." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the dim lamplight, and then she said something Daniel hadn't expected. "My mother would have liked you." "You barely know me. I know you well enough." She looked down at the drive in her hand, turning it over slowly. "My mother used to say that the measure of a person wasn't how they behaved when things were easy, but how they behaved when the stakes were real, and no one would blame them for walking away. You've had every reason to walk away from this weekend, Daniel. The money, the promotion, none of it required you to break into my brother's office at 1 a.m. You did that because it was right, not because it was part of the deal." Daniel felt something shift in his chest at her words. An unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the offer letter sitting folded in his bag, or the trust fund promised to Lily's future. "Maybe I did it because somewhere between the elevator 6 months ago and this weekend, I stopped seeing you as the ice queen everyone talks about at the office and started seeing someone who's been carrying too much alone for too long." The silence that followed felt different from every silence that had come before it that weekend. Not tense, not performative, but something quieter and more honest. Two people sitting in the aftermath of danger, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting. How the pretense they'd built for her father and brother had somewhere along the way started to feel less like pretense. "We should get some sleep," Victoria said finally, though she didn't move immediately. Today, I suppose, since it's already past 1, I need to call the forensic accountant, and we need to figure out exactly how to present this at the board meeting without giving Preston any warning. He already suspects something. Did you see his face at the barbecue when the board member complimented me? I saw it. He's scared, which means he might try something reckless before Monday even arrives. Victoria stood tucking the drive carefully into the inner pocket of her robe. "We need to be ready for that possibility too. Then we'll be ready." Daniel stood as well, and for a moment they faced each other in the dim light closer than the moment required, and something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged out loud. A flicker of something that had nothing to do with the arrangement they'd signed in her office 3 days ago. Something that felt dangerously, unexpectedly real. "Good night, Daniel," Victoria said softly, stepping back toward her room. "Good night, Tori." She paused at the use of the nickname, meant only for her father's ears, and something like a small, genuine smile touched her lips before she disappeared into her room, leaving Daniel alone with the memory of Preston's stolen fortune. The evidence drive now safely hidden, and the growing, unshakable certainty that whatever happened at Monday's board meeting the next 48 hours were going to determine far more than just who ran Hale Global Capital. They were going to determine what, if anything, was real between the two people who had walked into this weekend as strangers playing a part, and who were beginning, despite every warning either of them had given the other, to forget where the performance ended, and something else entirely had begun. Sunday morning arrived heavy with humidity and unspoken tension, the kind of stillness that settles over a house after something dangerous has happened in the dark, and nobody involved has said a word about it in daylight yet. Daniel woke to the sound of Victoria's voice through the thin wall separating their rooms, low and urgent already on the phone. He dressed quickly and found her in the sitting room. Laptop open, a woman's face frozen mid-sentence on a video call, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, sitting in what looked like a home office cluttered with filing boxes. "And you're certain the signature on the wire authorization matches Voss's known signature from prior filings," Victoria was saying. 96% confidence based on the samples you sent me, and that's a conservative estimate," the woman on the screen replied. "I've cross-referenced against 4 other documents bearing his authenticated signature from board records. This isn't a forgery, Victoria." Gerald Voss signed off on moving $40 million of pension trust assets into a shell entity he had every professional obligation to flag. He didn't just look the other way, he co-signed the crime. Daniel sat down quietly beside Victoria, and the woman's eyes flicked to him for a moment before returning to the matter at hand. "Margaret, this is Daniel Brooks," Victoria said. "He's the one who spotted the discrepancy in the original filing. Then Mr. Brooks has a sharper eye than the outside auditors your company paid a great deal of money to," Margaret said dryly. "I've traced the Windward Capital transfers as far as I can without subpoena power, which I don't have, and you shouldn't try to get before Monday. But what you have is more than sufficient. Wire authorization with 2 signatures, a shell entity, formed the same month the crypto venture launched, and an internal spreadsheet in your brother's own handwriting detailing exactly where the money went. That's not circumstantial. That's a paper trail a first-year prosecutor could walk a jury through in an afternoon. Can you have a written report ready by tomorrow morning before the board meeting? I'll have it to you by 6 a.m. But Victoria..." Margaret leaned closer to her camera, her voice dropping into something more personal. "I worked for your mother for 15 years. I watched her build half of what your father takes credit for. If she were alive to see what her son did to those pension accounts, it would break her heart twice over. Once for the theft, and once for the fact that it took his sister catching him instead of him ever having the decency to come to her first." Victoria's jaw tightened, something flickering behind her eyes that looked like grief layered under fury. "Thank you, Margaret. I mean that. Get some rest before tomorrow. You're going to need it." The call ended and Victoria sat back rubbing her eyes. "You didn't sleep," Daniel observed. "I slept in pieces. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that spreadsheet Preston's handwriting so casual, like he was budgeting for a vacation instead of laundering stolen pension money." She looked at Daniel, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "We have 24 hours until that board meeting, and Preston already suspects something's wrong. If he moves the rest of that money before Monday, or destroys evidence, or worse, he won't know until it's already too late to stop it," Daniel said. "You control the agenda for tomorrow's meeting. Don't give him any warning. Let him walk in believing he's still got the upper hand with your medical history. And if he tries something today, we still have to get through today, Daniel. A full day of family time, more guests arriving for the fireworks tonight, my father watching every interaction between us like he's still deciding whether to believe in you." Daniel reached over and took her hand, an instinct that had started as performance 3 days ago and no longer felt like performance at all. "Then we get through today the same way we got through yesterday. Together." The day unfolded with a strange, brittle normalcy. A late breakfast on the veranda. Richard Hale asking pointed but noticeably gentler questions about Daniel's daughter, about his late wife, about how he'd managed to raise a child alone while holding down a demanding job. Questions that felt less like an interrogation now and more like genuine curiosity from a man reconsidering an initial judgment. "Lily," Richard said, testing the name. "That's your daughter?" "Yes, sir. She's 8. And she's staying with your sister this weekend." "In New Jersey, yes." Richard nodded slowly, looking out at the ocean. "My daughter tells me you never once missed a work deadline in the 3 years since your wife passed. Is that true?" "I don't know if never is accurate, sir, but I tried hard not to let my daughter's needs become an excuse for poor work. She needed me to be steady in every part of my life, not just at home." "That's a harder thing to do than most people understand," Richard said quietly. "I lost my wife 4 years ago, and I let the company absorb my grief instead of my family. I'm not proud of that." He glanced toward Victoria, who was speaking with a caterer near the tent, unaware her father was watching her. "I look at my daughter, and I see someone who did what I couldn't. She held the company together and grieved at the same time, and I punished her for it by doubting her instead of admiring her." Daniel said nothing, sensing the older man wasn't finished, that something significant was working its way loose after decades of silence. "I don't know what's real between you two, Mr. Brooks, and some part of me suspects there's more to this weekend than either of you have told me. But I've watched you for 3 days now, and whatever the truth is underneath it, I've seen the way she looks at you when she thinks no one's paying attention. I haven't seen that look on her face since she was a very young woman, long before this company made her hard. He turned back to Daniel, his expression unreadable, but no longer hostile. Whatever happens tomorrow at that board meeting, I want you to know I intend to support my daughter. Preston has been feeding me doubts about her for 2 years, and until this weekend, I let him, because doubt was easier than confronting my own failures as a father. That ends now. Before Daniel could respond, Preston's voice cut across the veranda sharp and deliberately loud enough to carry. Ending what now, Dad, sounds like a private conversation I should probably be part of. Richard's expression closed instantly, the openness of a moment ago, sealing back behind decades of practiced control. Nothing that concerns you yet, Preston. Everything concerns me, Dad. I'm still a Hale last I checked, even if my sister's new boyfriend seems determined to make me feel otherwise. Preston's eyes cut to Daniel, something harder and more calculating than the mockery of the previous days. You've been busy this weekend, haven't you, Daniel? Charming my father. Standing up to me at dinner. Very impressive performance for someone who's known my sister for 8 months. I don't need to perform anything, Preston. I just don't back down when someone tries to intimidate me. Is that what I've been doing? Intimidating you? Preston laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. Careful, Daniel. Men who think they've won usually haven't checked the scoreboard. He walked away, and Richard watched him go, with an expression of deep, tired concern. He's planning something, Richard said quietly. I know my son. That tone means he believes he still holds a card none of us know about. He does. Daniel thought, though he said nothing, his mind flashing to Victoria's hospitalization 4 years ago, the secret Preston intended to weaponize in front of the entire board. Whatever satisfaction Daniel felt about the pension evidence sitting safely on that encrypted drive was tempered by the knowledge that Preston still believed he held the more devastating weapon, and a cornered man with a weapon like that was more dangerous than one who'd already lost. That evening, fireworks lit up the sky above the estate's private stretch of beach. The entire extended family and remaining guests gathered on blankets and folding chairs to watch the display Richard Hale had commissioned every year of Victoria's life. Daniel sat beside her, her hand in his, the sky exploding in gold and red and blue above the dark water, and for a few minutes watching the light reflect off her face, he almost forgot the danger waiting for them the next morning. My mother loved this part of the summer, Victoria said quietly, watching the sky. She used to say the 4th of July was the one night a year when everyone in this family stopped pretending to be something they weren't and just watched the sky together. Did it work? Did everyone actually stop pretending? For about 20 minutes a year. Then the fireworks would end and everyone would go back to being exactly who they'd always been. She looked at him, the reflected light still flickering across her features. I used to hate this holiday. It always felt like a performance of togetherness that evaporated the second the last firework went off. And now, she was quiet for a moment, watching another burst of gold light bloom and fade above the water. Now I think maybe it doesn't have to evaporate. Maybe some of it can actually be real if you find the right person to watch it with. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, something that had nothing to do with fear of tomorrow's board meeting and everything to do with the woman sitting beside him, her hand warm in his, her guard lowered further than he suspected it had been in years. He wanted to say something back, something honest, but before he could find the words, a low voice spoke from behind them. Isn't this touching? Preston's silhouette stood against the glow of the fireworks, a drink in his hand, his voice carrying none of its earlier playfulness. Enjoy the show, you two. Tomorrow, the real fireworks start. He walked away into the dark before either of them could respond, and Victoria's hand tightened around Daniel's, the warmth of the moment replaced instantly by the cold reality of what was coming. He knows something, she said. Or he thinks he does. Let him think whatever he wants, Daniel said. Tomorrow morning, we'll know if what he thinks matters at all. Monday arrived gray and humid, the kind of morning that felt like the sky itself was holding its breath. Margaret's forensic report landed in Victoria's inbox at 5:52 a.m., 17 pages of methodical damning detail that Daniel read twice over coffee, while Victoria showered and dressed for the board meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock in the estate's private conference room, a space normally used for informal strategy sessions that Richard had converted for this one occasion into a battlefield. "You ready?" Daniel asked, as they stood outside the conference room doors at 5 minutes to 9. The encrypted drive tucked into Victoria's jacket pocket, a printed copy of Margaret's report in a folder under Daniel's arm. "No," Victoria admitted, "but I'm going in anyway." They entered together, and the room fell into the particular hush that accompanies powerful people arranging themselves for a confrontation. They can sense coming, even if they don't know its exact shape. Richard sat at the head of the long table, flanked by board members from the barbecue. The state senator conspicuously absent, but two other major shareholders present their faces carefully neutral. Preston sat near the opposite end, a folder of his own in front of him, a small, confident smile playing at the corner of his mouth that made Daniel's stomach tighten with dread. "Let's begin," Richard said, calling the meeting to order. "As chairman emeritus, I've called this session at my daughter's request to discuss quarterly performance and division restructuring proposals. Victoria, the floor is yours." Victoria stood, and Daniel watched her transform in real time, the exhausted, vulnerable woman from the fireworks the night before, folding itself away beneath the composed, commanding CEO who ran board meetings for a living. "Thank you. Before we discuss restructuring, I want to address something that requires this board's immediate attention." "Actually," Preston interrupted smoothly, rising from his chair before she could continue. "If I may?" "Victoria, I think there's something more pressing this board needs to consider before any restructuring discussion, something concerning your fitness to continue leading this company." The room went still. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Preston, your sister has the floor. With respect, Dad, this can't wait. It concerns matters of trust, and I think everyone in this room deserves the full truth before they vote on anything my sister proposes today." Preston opened his folder, and Daniel felt Victoria go rigid beside him. 4 years ago, Victoria was hospitalized for 11 days, following what her medical records describe as a severe stress-induced psychiatric episode. She was diagnosed with acute depression and anxiety treated with medication that, according to these records, she continued taking for over a year afterward. This board has been led to believe Victoria Hale is a stable, unshakable leader. I have documentation suggesting otherwise, and I believe this board has a right to know exactly who they've entrusted with a multi-billion-dollar company. Gasps rippled around the table. One of the shareholders leaned forward, his expression sharpening with concern. Richard's face had gone pale, his hands clenched on the table in front of him. "Preston." Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. "Where did you obtain private medical records?" "That's not the point, Dad. The point is whether this board wants a leader who collapsed under pressure once already and could do so again." Victoria stood perfectly still, and Daniel watched her absorb the blow, watched every eye in the room turn toward her, waiting to see if she would crumble, the way Preston clearly expected, the way he had built his entire strategy around assuming she would. She didn't crumble. "Yes," Victoria said, her voice steady, carrying clearly across the room. "I was hospitalized 4 years ago. I was exhausted grieving my mother's terminal illness while running this company, essentially alone, because my father," she glanced at Richard, not unkindly, "was understandably consumed by his own grief, and my brother was 3,000 miles away pursuing his own ventures. I broke down because I was human, and because I was carrying more weight than any one person should carry without support. I got treatment. I did the work. I came back stronger, more self-aware, and more capable than I had ever been before. I am not ashamed of that history, and I refuse to let my brother weaponize a moment of human vulnerability as though it were a disqualifying character flaw." She looked directly at Preston. "What I am ashamed of, Preston, is that you would violate my medical privacy, a serious legal violation, I should add, for everyone in this room to note in a desperate attempt to distract this board from the actual crisis facing this company." There is no other crisis, Preston said, though something in his voice had wavered slightly. There is. Victoria nodded to Daniel, and he stepped forward, setting the folder on the table and opening it, sliding copies of the key documents toward the board members closest to him. My name is Daniel Brooks, he said, his voice carrying with a calm authority that surprised even him. I'm a senior risk analyst at Hale Global. 2 days ago, while reviewing historical division filings, I discovered an irregularity in the reporting of the crypto infrastructure venture this board approved funding for 18 months ago. He gestured to the documents now circulating around the table. The $40 million this board was told was lost to a failed technology venture was in fact transferred out of the Employee Pension Trust into a shell entity called Windward Capital Holdings, registered in Delaware the same month the venture was announced. I have wire authorization documents bearing 2 signatures, Preston Hale's and Gerald Voss's, your chief compliance officer, who co-signed the transfer despite having a professional and legal obligation to flag it. The room had gone utterly silent, every board member's eyes now fixed on the documents in front of them instead of on Victoria. This is fabricated, Preston said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence, cracking slightly at the edges. This is a desperate attempt by my sister to discredit me before I could expose the truth about her stability. It's not fabricated, Daniel said evenly, sliding another document across the table. This is an independent forensic accounting report prepared by Margaret Chen, a certified fraud examiner, who has verified the signature authenticity at 96% confidence and traced the fund flow directly to accounts controlled by you, including $12 million moved to a personal investment account in the Cayman Islands, and $8 million used to purchase a controlling interest in a private aviation company registered under your ex-wife's maiden name. He looked up, meeting Preston's eyes directly. You stole $40 million from the retirement accounts of 12,000 employees. Preston and you were prepared to destroy your sister's reputation using her private medical history to make sure nobody ever looked closely enough to find it. The color drained entirely from Preston's face. Around the table, board members who moments ago had been leaning toward genuine concern about Victoria's fitness to lead were now staring at Preston with expressions ranging from disbelief to open fury. This is insane, Preston said, his voice rising, panic beginning to bleed through the practiced composure. You expect this board to believe some risk analyst dug through company filings and just happened to find... I expect this board to believe an independent forensic accountant's signed report, Victoria said, cutting him off, along with a spreadsheet recovered from your own laptop in your own handwriting, detailing exactly where every dollar of that $40 million went. She let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. Daniel found the discrepancy because he's exceptionally good at his job, Preston. Something you might understand if you'd ever bothered to actually run your division instead of using it as a personal piggy bank. Richard Hale had been silent through the entire exchange, his face a mask of controlled fury. But now he stood slowly, his hands flat on the table, his eyes fixed on his son with an expression Daniel had never seen on the older man's face before. Not disappointment, but something closer to grief. Preston, Richard said quietly. Is this true? Preston's mouth opened and closed several times. No sound coming out. His eyes darting around the table as if searching for an ally who no longer existed in the room. Is this true? Richard repeated each word, landing like a hammer blow. Dad, I can explain. That's not an answer. Richard's voice had gone cold, colder than Daniel had ever heard from the old man, colder even than Victoria's reputation had ever suggested she was capable of. You stole from the people who built this company alongside me for 30 years. Machinists, secretaries, men and women who trusted us with their retirements because we told them we would protect it. And you used my daughter's darkest moment as a weapon to distract from your own crimes. He looked around the table at the assembled board members, his voice regaining its full authority. I move that Preston Hale be immediately removed from all positions within Hale Global Capital, that his division be placed under independent audit, and that this matter be referred to federal authorities for criminal investigation. Seconded, said the red-faced board member from the barbecue, his earlier joviality replaced by grim resolve. All in favor, Richard said. The vote was unanimous, every hand around the table rising except Preston's own. His face now the color of ash, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning horrified realization that everything he had built his identity around, the family name, the assumed inheritance of power, the belief that he was untouchable, had collapsed in the span of 15 minutes. "You can't do this," Preston said, his voice small now, stripped of all its earlier menace. "I'm still a Hale. You stopped being someone I recognize as my son the moment you decided stealing from 12,000 families was an acceptable price for your own ambition," Richard said. "Security will escort you from the property. Your legal counsel will be in touch. I suggest you retain the best criminal defense attorney money can buy because you're going to need it." 2 security personnel entered the room at Richard's signal, clearly summoned in advance, which told Daniel that Richard had suspected on some level that this confrontation was coming, and stood on either side of Preston's chair, waiting. Preston stood slowly, gathering what remained of his composure, and for one final moment his eyes found Victoria's across the table. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "Both of you." "No," Victoria said, her voice steady, carrying none of the satisfaction Daniel might have expected, and instead something closer to sadness. "I think for the first time in years, I finally won't." Preston was led from the room in silence, the heavy conference room doors closing behind him with a soft final click that seemed to echo louder than anything that had been said in the last 20 minutes. The board members sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over the room like a physical presence. Richard turned to look at his daughter, and something in his weathered face had shifted entirely. Decades of doubt and distance dissolving into an expression Daniel recognized instantly, because he wore something like it himself every time he looked at his daughter, unguarded, aching pride. "Victoria," Richard said quietly, his voice thick with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel out loud in years. "I am so sorry it took me this long to see you clearly." The room stayed quiet for a long moment after Richard's words, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has finally broken and everyone left standing is still learning how to breathe in the aftermath. Victoria didn't answer her father right away. She looked at him, this man who had spent 4 years treating her like a liability instead of a daughter. And Daniel watched something pass across her face that was too complicated to name. Relief, tangled with old hurt, vindication, tangled with a grief that had nothing to do with Preston at all. "You don't have to apologize to me in front of the board, Dad," she said quietly. "Yes, I do." Richard's voice was rough, unfamiliar, even to himself it seemed. "I owe you this apology in front of every single person who has ever doubted you, because I was the first one to plant that doubt, and I let your brother water it for 2 years while I stood by and did nothing." He looked around the table at the assembled board members, none of whom seemed inclined to look away from this moment, however uncomfortable it made them. "My daughter ran this company through her mother's death, through her own health crisis, through a brother who was quietly stealing from our own employees, and she never once asked for credit or sympathy. She simply did the work. I mistook her strength for something to be suspicious of because it was easier than admitting my own weakness. That ends today." He turned to the rest of the board. "I move that this board issue a formal vote of full confidence in Victoria Hale's leadership, effective immediately and permanently, with no further review clauses attached to her position." "Seconded," said the red-faced board member. And this time when the vote came, it wasn't just unanimous, it came with something Daniel hadn't expected: a small, spontaneous round of applause from several of the older board members. The kind of gesture that men who managed billions of dollars rarely allowed themselves in a professional setting. Victoria stood very still through it, her hand finding Daniel's beneath the table again, gripping it tightly enough that he could feel the tremor running through her fingers, the accumulated weight of 4 years finally beginning to lift. "Thank you," she said when the room quieted again. "All of you. I promise you this company is in steadier hands than it has been in a long time, and I intend to spend the next decade proving that beyond any doubt." The meeting dissolved shortly after into a flurry of logistics legal counsel being summoned to formalize Preston's removal. a compliance team dispatched to freeze Gerald Voss's accounts and begin the process of clawing back what remained of the stolen pension funds, a public relations strategy being sketched out to control how the story would be handled once it inevitably reached the press. Daniel found himself standing slightly apart from it all, watching Victoria move through the chaos with a calm, commanding energy that reminded him with a small jolt of the very first time he'd seen her at that all-staff meeting years ago. Except now, there was no coldness in it, only clarity. It was nearly noon before the room finally emptied, board members filing out to make calls. Richard lingering by the door for a long moment before he approached Daniel, directly extending his hand. "Mr. Brooks? Mr. Hale, I owe you an apology as well. I spent this entire weekend testing you, trying to catch you in a lie, because I've learned to distrust anyone who enters this family's orbit." Richard's grip was firm, his eyes steady. "You found $40 million of fraud that our own auditors missed for 18 months. You stood your ground against my son when he tried to provoke you, and whatever the nature of your relationship with my daughter actually is." He paused, something knowing flickering behind his weathered eyes. "I've watched enough people pretend at things in my life to know the difference between performance and the real thing. Whatever this is between you two, I don't think it's pretend anymore, if it ever entirely was." Daniel felt his throat tighten, caught off guard by how precisely the old man had seen through to the heart of something Daniel himself hadn't fully admitted yet. "Sir, You don't need to explain yourself to me, Mr. Brooks. I've done enough interrogating for one weekend." Richard actually smiled, then small and tired, but genuine, the first real smile Daniel had seen on his face since arriving. "Take care of my daughter. She's spent too many years taking care of everyone else." He walked away, leaving Daniel standing alone in the emptying conference room, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear anymore. They flew back to New York that evening, Victoria having arranged a small private plane rather than face the holiday traffic clogging every route off Long Island, and for the first 20 minutes of the flight, neither of them spoke, both still absorbing the enormity of what had happened in that conference room, the way an entire family's power structure had rearranged itself in the space of a single meeting. "You're quiet," Victoria said, finally watching him from across the narrow cabin. "I'm processing. 3 days ago, I was drafting a resignation letter in my head because I thought I was about to get fired. Now I've helped uncover a felony, watched a family collapse and rebuild itself in real time, and I'm flying home on a private plane like this is somehow a normal Monday. Nothing about this weekend was normal." Victoria unbuckled her seatbelt and moved to sit across from him, instead, closer, the plane's engine humming steadily beneath them as Manhattan's skyline began to sharpen in the distance below the wing. "Daniel, I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond, because if I stop halfway through, I don't think I'll find the courage to start again." "Okay." She took a breath, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and for a moment she looked less like the CEO who had just dismantled her brother's criminal empire in front of a room full of billionaires, and more like the exhausted, frightened woman who had asked Daniel to help her survive one weekend, unsure if she'd survive it at all. "When I asked you to do this, it was purely transactional in my mind. I needed a solution to a problem, and you were the most logical, least complicated solution available to me. I told myself that repeatedly over the last week, because it was easier than admitting the truth, which is that I have spent 3 years running this company completely alone, surrounded by people who either wanted something from me or were afraid of me. And in 3 days, you managed to become the first person in, longer than I can remember, who simply stood beside me because it was the right thing to do." Her voice wavered slightly. "You didn't have to defend me at that dinner table. You didn't have to break into my brother's office at 1 a.m. You didn't have to say the things you said to my father on that beach or hold my hand through a board meeting that could have destroyed everything I've built. You did all of it anyway, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped being able to tell where the performance ended and something real began." Daniel felt his heart pounding against his ribs, the city lights glittering below them through the small window. And he thought about every moment of the last 3 days. The offer letter that had started all of this. The fear that had driven him to say yes. The strange, unexpected warmth that had grown between them in stolen moments neither of them had planned for. "I felt it too," he said quietly. "I told myself the same thing you did, that this was just a job, an arrangement, something I was doing for my daughter's future and nothing more. But somewhere between watching you stand up to your father on that dune grass and watching you refuse to break in front of your brother this morning, I stopped seeing an assignment. I started seeing someone I actually wanted to protect, not because a piece of paper told me to, but because I wanted to." Victoria's eyes were bright, something vulnerable and hopeful, breaking through the composure she'd spent a lifetime perfecting. "So what happens now? Monday's over. The arrangement is technically finished." Daniel reached across the small space between them and took her hand the same way he had 100 times over the last 3 days for the benefit of an audience. Except now, there was no audience at all. Only the two of them, and the hum of the engine and the city rising up to meet them below. "Now," he said, "I think we find out what this actually is without a script, without an audience, without an offer letter telling either of us what we're supposed to feel. No more pretending. Just you and me figuring it out for real." Victoria smiled, then fully unguarded, the kind of smile Daniel imagined her father hadn't seen since she was a very young woman, long before grief and pressure and betrayal had taught her to armor herself against the world. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." The plane began its descent toward the city Manhattan spreading out beneath them in a grid of light, and Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. Something in her posture finally completely at rest, for the first time in longer than Daniel suspected she could remember. He wrapped his arm around her, watching the city rise to meet them, and felt something settle in his own chest as well. Not the desperate grinding anxiety that had defined every day of his life for the last 3 years, but something quieter, steadier, something that felt for the first time in a long time like the beginning of a future he hadn't dared to imagine for himself.
चैप्टर जो है
The weeks that followed unfolded with the strange, dizzying speed of a life being rebuilt from the ground up. The story of Preston Hale's arrest broke in the financial press within days, the SEC and federal prosecutors moving quickly once Margaret's forensic report and the recovered documents were formally submitted, and the coverage was as Victoria had predicted. Extensive photographs of Preston being led out of a Manhattan courthouse in handcuffs. Headlines about embezzled pension funds and shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Quiet mentions buried in the later paragraphs of articles about Gerald Voss's own indictment for his role in co-signing the fraudulent transfer. Victoria handled the press with the same steady composure she'd shown in that conference room, giving a single carefully worded statement, expressing her commitment to full transparency and complete restitution for every affected employee, and then largely retreating from the spotlight to focus on the actual work of rebuilding trust within the company. Daniel watched her in the weeks that followed personally review every pension account affected by the fraud, insisting on meeting individually with several longtime employees whose retirements had been put at risk, a level of hands-on accountability that surprised board members accustomed to executives who delegated such matters to public relations teams. "You didn't have to do that," Daniel told her one evening after she'd returned from a 2-hour meeting with a retired machinist named Walter Coombs, who'd worked at Hale Global's manufacturing subsidiary for 31 years and had been 3 months from retirement when the fraud nearly cost him his pension. "Yes, I did," Victoria said, kicking off her shoes at the door of the apartment she'd insisted on visiting, more often than Daniel had expected, given her own sprawling penthouse a mile uptown. Walter trusted this company with 31 years of his working life. "The least I owe him is an hour of my time and an honest apology, not a form letter drafted by legal." Daniel's own life had transformed in ways that still occasionally stunned him when he stopped to notice them. The promotion had gone through exactly as promised. Senior Risk Officer, a title and salary that meant he no longer lay awake at night, counting pennies, meant Lily's college trust sat fully funded, and untouchable meant the electric bill got paid the day it arrived instead of the day before the shutoff notice. But more than the money, something had shifted in how he moved through the world, a weight lifted, that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying until it was gone. Lily, for her part, had taken the sudden appearance of Victoria in her father's life with the uncomplicated openness that only children seem capable of asking her the first time they met properly over dinner. Whether she liked dogs, whether she knew how to braid hair, and whether she was going to be her father's girlfriend. For real, or just for a little while, like some of the ladies from his work who came over that one time and never came back. For real, Victoria had told her with a seriousness that made Daniel's chest ache. If your dad will have me. He'll have you, Lily had said with the blunt confidence of an 8-year-old. He talks about you a lot, more than he talked about anyone since Mom. Victoria had gone quiet at that, and later that night after Lily had gone to bed, she'd sat with Daniel on the small couch in his apartment, a couch that suddenly seemed painfully modest, compared to everything in her own life. Though she'd never once made him feel that way about it, and asked him carefully whether it was too soon, whether she was moving too fast into a role that belonged by every right to a mother who had died too young. You're not replacing her mother, Daniel said. Nobody could, and I'd never ask you to try. But Lily spent 3 years watching me hold everything together alone, and some part of her has been waiting for someone else to walk through the door and stay. You staying isn't erasing anything. It's just adding something good to a life that's had enough heart in it already. 3 months after that 4th of July weekend on a crisp October evening, Richard Hale hosted a much smaller gathering at the Hamptons estate. No board members. This time, no shareholders, just family, or what remained of family, after Preston's absence, had carved out a space that nobody quite knew how to fill yet. Daniel and Lily attended together, Victoria having insisted, and Daniel watched with quiet amazement as Richard Hale, the man who had spent 4 years treating his own daughter with suspicion, sat on the back porch with an 8-year-old girl he'd met only twice before, patiently helping her identify constellations in the clear autumn sky. Your grandfather used to do this with me, Victoria said, standing beside Daniel on the lawn watching the two of them. Before my mother got sick, before everything got complicated, I'd forgotten he even remembered the constellations. People remember the good parts of themselves eventually, Daniel said. Sometimes it just takes losing everything else first to find the part worth keeping. Victoria leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, watching her father point up at the sky, while Lily squinted trying to trace the shape he was describing. Preston's trial starts in January, she said quietly. The prosecutors think it's a straightforward case given the evidence, but it's still going to be hard. He's still my brother whatever he did. You don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt. I know. I think that's actually the thing I've learned most from this whole ordeal, that I don't have to pretend anymore. Not with the board, not with my father, not with you. She looked up at him, the porch lights catching the warmth in her expression, so different from the guarded, exhausted woman who had summoned him to her office 3 months earlier with an offer that had seemed at the time like the strangest and most desperate proposition he'd ever heard. I spent years thinking strength meant never letting anyone see the cracks. You taught me that real strength is letting the right person see them and trusting they won't use them against you. Daniel thought about everything that had happened since that morning in her office. The fear, the performance that had become real, the danger of that midnight break-in, the courage it had taken for her to stand in front of that board and refuse to be broken by her own brother's cruelty. He thought about how close he'd come to saying no to her offer to walking away out of fear, and how different his life would look now if he had. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think I could have used them against you even if I wanted to. Somewhere in the middle of that weekend, protecting you stopped being part of the arrangement and started being something I just wanted to do. Victoria smiled and reached up to press her palm against his cheek. The gesture unguarded and entirely without performance, no audience left to convince of anything. I love you, Daniel Brooks. She said the words simple and unadorned, carrying none of the careful calculation that had defined every interaction of their first meeting. Not the version of you that showed up to save my company. The version of you that shows up every single day for your daughter, for the people you work with, for me. That's the man I fell for somewhere between the elevator and the fireworks and the board meeting that changed both our lives. I love you too, Daniel said, and the words felt lighter leaving his mouth than any words had in 3 years, unburdened by fear. unburdened by the careful math of survival that had governed every choice he'd made since his wife's death. "I think I fell for you the night you told me about your mother's gardenias. And I realized underneath the Ice Queen everyone talked about at the office, there was just a woman who'd never once been asked if she was okay." They stood together on the lawn as the last of the evening light faded from the sky, Richard's laughter drifting over from the porch as Lily pointed excitedly at a shooting star neither adult had noticed, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future ahead of them felt less like a risk to be calculated and more like a promise worth keeping. 6 months later, Hale Global Capital reported its strongest quarter in company history. The pension fund fully restored and independently audited employee trust rebuilt through months of transparent communication that Victoria personally oversaw. Daniel had been promoted again this time to Chief Risk Officer, a position that placed him formally on the executive team. No longer a fake boyfriend playing a role for a skeptical family, but a legitimate leader whose judgment the entire company had come to trust, built not on a lie told at a barbecue, but on the genuine competence and integrity he demonstrated when it mattered most. Richard Hale retired fully that spring, handing over his remaining shares and advisory role to Victoria without a single condition attached, telling the assembled board at his final meeting that he had finally, after 72 years, learned the difference between strength that needs to be tested and strength that has already proven itself beyond any reasonable doubt. And on a warm afternoon in June, almost exactly a year after that first desperate offer in a glass office 60 floors above Manhattan, Daniel Brooks stood on the same stretch of Hampton's lawn where he had once stood terrified and unprepared, meeting Richard Hale for the first time as a stranger playing a part. Except this time, he stood there as Victoria's husband Lily beside him, in a white dress with tiny stars embroidered along the hem. Exactly the kind of dress she'd asked to wear on that ordinary Tuesday morning, so many months ago, before either of their lives had changed beyond recognition. Victoria walked toward him across the same lawn where Preston had once mocked him, where Richard had once tested him with careful, suspicious questions, where the two of them had once pretended at a love that had somewhere along the way become the truest and most real thing either of them had ever built. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered slightly. Gardenias, woven through her dark hair in quiet tribute to the woman who hadn't lived to see this day, but who Victoria was certain, in the way people become certain of things they can't prove but need desperately to believe, would have loved the man standing at the end of the aisle waiting for her. Richard gave her away with tears he made no attempt to hide, whispering something to Daniel as he placed her hand in his that Daniel would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Thank you for seeing what I was too afraid to see for far too long." And as the sun began its slow descent over the same ocean that had witnessed every secret, every confrontation, every quiet moment of truth between them over the course of one impossible 4th of July weekend, Daniel Brooks understood, standing there with the woman who had once needed him to lie for her survival and now stood beside him needing nothing but the truth of who they actually were to each other. That some lies are simply the rough, frightened beginning of the truest stories a life can tell, and that his had only just begun.